What if I told you that modern armies, the formations, discipline, and tactics used today, did not begin in Europe? What if the strategies that shaped global warfare were perfected in Africa, then erased from history? And what if the world's most powerful militaries borrowed from African systems, without ever giving credit? Stay with me, because once you hear this, you will never see history the same way again. For centuries, the world was taught a dangerous lie, that Africa had warriors, but no strategy, that Africa had strength, but no structure, that Africa fought with chaos, while the rest of the world mastered order. But that story was not just wrong. It was deliberately erased. Because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that Africa mastered organized warfare long before modern armies existed. And tonight, we're uncovering the African military systems that quietly shaped the way the world fights wars. Long before European standing armies, long before military academies, long before uniforms and formations, African societies had disciplined regiments, hierarchical command systems, psychological warfare, and battlefield formations designed for efficiency, speed, and dominance. These were not tribal skirmishes. They were systems. Systems so effective that colonial forces were shocked when they encountered them. And when shock turned into fear, fear turned into erasure. In many African civilizations, warfare was not just about strength. It was about discipline, coordination, psychology, timing, terrain mastery. African commanders understood something critical. Winning a war begins long before the first spear is thrown. They trained soldiers to move as one unit, not as individuals. They drilled formations repeatedly. They enforced strict discipline. Desertion was often punishable by death. They understood morale, fear, and intimidation. This was not accidental warfare. This was strategic design. One of the most erased truths is this. African armies were among the earliest users of age-based regimental systems. Young men were grouped by age, trained together, lived together, and fought together. This created loyalty, trust, coordination, unbreakable unity in battle. Sound familiar? That same concept later appeared in European military structures. Recruits trained together, deployed together, commanded together. But history rarely tells you where the idea came from. African armies didn't fight randomly. They used formations designed to surround, confuse, and overwhelm enemies. Some formations focused on fixing the enemy in place, flanking from both sides, cutting off retreat paths, attacking morale, not just bodies. These ideas mirror tactics used centuries later in modern warfare. Encirclement, pincer movements, shock and awe strategies. Africa was practicing this long before it had names. Here's something history rarely discusses. African armies understood that fear wins battles faster than weapons. They used war chants timed echo across valleys, coordinated movements to appear larger than they were, symbolism, uniforms, and intimidation tactics, strategic silence before attack. Enemies often fled before combat even began. This wasn't superstition. It was psychology. And today, psychological warfare is taught in military schools worldwide without mentioning its African roots. So if Africa was this advanced, why don't we learn this? Because colonial narratives needed Africa to appear disorganized, primitive, incapable of complex systems. Admitting Africa mastered warfare would destroy the justification for conquest. So history was rewritten. African victories were minimized. African systems were ignored. African intelligence was dismissed. And what couldn't be ignored was taken quietly. When European forces finally encountered organized African armies, the shock was undeniable. They did not meet chaos. They met discipline. They did not meet confusion. They met formations, command structures, and tactical brilliance. But instead of acknowledging this publicly, colonial records reframed African resistance as savage aggression. Why? Because admitting respect would mean admitting fear. Here's the uncomfortable truth. European powers studied African resistance carefully. They observed how African units moved, how leaders commanded loyalty, how formations adapted to terrain, how morale was controlled. And over time, elements of these systems appeared in colonial and later global military doctrines. But the credit was erased. The origin was silenced. If Africa was truly disorganized, why did it take decades of warfare to conquer certain regions? Why did colonial forces suffer repeated losses? Why were African leaders described as dangerously intelligent in private correspondence? Because deep down they knew the truth. We're going deeper. We'll reveal how African military discipline reshaped global command systems, the specific tactics that modern armies still use today, and how one African warrior culture would later produce a military genius, Shaka Zulu. So stay with me, because the story history erased is just getting started. We uncover the truth history tried to bury, that Africa mastered organized warfare, discipline, formations, and psychological strategy long before modern armies existed. But now comes a question that history never wanted answered. What happened to these systems? And who carried them forward? African military leadership was not based on chaos or brute force. It was built on clear command structures. Orders flowed from commanders to unit leaders, then to soldiers, fast, direct, unquestioned. Disobedience wasn't tolerated. Cowardice wasn't excused. Unity wasn't optional. This concept of absolute command authority later became central to modern military doctrine. Yet history framed African leadership as warlord rule, a deliberate distortion. In truth, African commanders understood something essential. A disciplined army can defeat a larger, better armed force. In many African warrior societies, military training wasn't something you joined. It was life itself. Young boys were trained early. Endurance, speed, coordination, obedience, loyalty to the group. By the time they became soldiers, discipline was instinct. Modern militaries call this conditioning. Africa perfected it centuries earlier. One of the most underestimated African military strengths was adaptability. African armies adjusted tactics based on terrain, weather, enemy behavior, weapon limitations. If a tactic failed, it was abandoned immediately. If an enemy adapted, African forces adapted faster. This flexibility is now a cornerstone of modern warfare. But once again, the origin was erased. It's often said that Africa fell because Europe had better weapons. But that's only half the truth. In many early encounters, African armies outmaneuvered and outthought technologically superior forces. What ultimately shifted the balance wasn't intelligence. It was industrialized weaponry and endless resources. And even then, resistance continued far longer than history admits. Why? Because African systems worked. Colonial powers rarely admitted fear publicly, but private journals, letters, and reports told a different story. African leaders were described as highly strategic, unusually disciplined, dangerously capable, difficult to break. These words were never meant for textbooks. They were buried. Once conquest was achieved, the final step was control of memory. African military victories were excluded from curricula. African strategies were labeled primitive. African intelligence was reframed as instinct, not intellect. This wasn't accidental. It was policy, because the people who know their power are harder to rule. But systems don't die easily. They evolve. They are passed down through culture, memory, and resistance. And in southern Africa, one warrior culture preserved, refined, and intensified these military principles. That culture will produce a leader whose name still echoes across history. A man shaped by discipline, forged by rejection, and obsessed with order, speed, and dominance. His name was Shaka. Shaka Zulu did not invent African military discipline. He perfected it. He took ancient systems, regiments, formations, psychological warfare, absolute command, and sharpened them into something the world could no longer ignore. Shaka was not an anomaly. He was the proof of what Africa had always been capable of. This isn't about rewriting history for pride. It's about restoring truth. Because when you believe your ancestors had no systems, no intelligence, no strategy, you accept limitation. But when you know the truth, you walk differently. You think differently. You lead differently. If Africa's military system shaped global warfare, what else has history erased? And what happens when those stories are finally told? In the next video, we're going deep into the life of Shaka Zulu. Not the legend you've heard, but the boy history tried to forget. If this story changed how you see history, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel for more untold and intriguing Black history stories. Because the stories they erased are the ones that matter most.